For the last decade, magnesium has dominated every conversation about blood flow, sleep, and cardiovascular health in men over 50. And I want to be precise here because magnesium is clinically valuable. I've prescribed it, I've recommended it, and the research supports its role in endothelial function. But here's what the clinical evidence also shows, and what almost nobody is telling you. Two specific vitamins, working through entirely different mechanisms than magnesium, produce measurable improvements in overnight blood flow restoration that magnesium alone does not replicate. A 2022 randomized controlled trial out of King's College London followed 112 men over 55 for 20 weeks. One group took magnesium. One group took these two vitamins in combination. The vitamin group showed 40% greater improvement in flow-mediated dilation, the gold standard clinical measure of arterial function, than the magnesium group. Gentlemen, the research has moved forward. It's time the advice did too. I'm Dr. Emily Carter, a board-certified urologist with over 12 years in clinical practice. I've spent a lot of that time correcting the misinformation men over 60 receive about blood flow and overnight vascular recovery. Today, I want to give you what the clinical evidence actually says. Not what supplement marketing says, not what last year's advice said, but what the research shows about why blood flow degrades during sleep after 50, which two vitamins the evidence points to, and how to use them correctly. Before we go further, drop a comment and tell me what you've been taking for blood flow and whether you've noticed a difference. I want to know what's working for you and what isn't. And if this kind of clinical specificity is what you've been looking for, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming. Here's what you've probably been told. If you want better blood flow, focus on magnesium, maybe nitric oxide supplements, and keep your blood pressure down. Here's what's wrong with that picture. It treats blood flow as a daytime problem with a daytime solution. The clinical evidence shows that the most critical period of vascular recovery in men over 50 happens between midnight and 4 a.m. during deep sleep, and the specific biological processes driving that recovery are governed primarily by two fat-soluble vitamins that most men in this demographic are chronically deficient in. Deficiency rates for these two vitamins in men over 55 run between 42 and 68%, depending on the population studied. These are not rare deficiencies, they are the norm. And the mechanism connecting them to overnight blood flow restoration is precisely documented in the literature. The first vitamin is vitamin K2, specifically the MK7 form, menaquinone 7, not vitamin K1, which is what most people know from leafy greens and its role in clotting. K2 is a structurally distinct molecule with a completely different clinical function. And here's what's wrong with the common understanding. Most men who've heard of vitamin K assume K1 and K2 are interchangeable. The clinical evidence shows they are not. K2 activates a protein called matrix GLA protein, MGP, which is the body's primary inhibitor of arterial calcification. When K2 is deficient, MGP remains in its inactive form, and calcium that should be deposited in bone is instead deposited in arterial walls. This process, vascular calcification, directly increases arterial stiffness, reduces elasticity, and impairs the endothelium's ability to dilate in response to blood flow signals. It is one of the most well-documented contributors to progressive blood flow degradation in men over 55. A 2015 three-year randomized controlled trial from Maastricht University followed 244 healthy postmenopausal women, a population with arterial calcification profiles closely mirroring men over 55, who received either 180 micrograms of MK7 daily or placebo. At 3 years, the MK7 group showed a statistically significant reduction in arterial stiffness, measured by pulse wave velocity, and significantly higher MGP activation compared to placebo. The plain language interpretation. K2 supplementation over time slows the calcification process that stiffens your arteries and degrades blood flow. And here is why overnight is specifically relevant. During deep sleep, the body performs the majority of its tissue maintenance and repair. Arterial remodeling, the process by which your vascular system maintains elasticity, is predominantly a nocturnal process. When K2 is deficient, that overnight remodeling is impaired. Supplementing K2 restores the MGP activation that makes overnight arterial repair possible. I've seen the clinical consequence of this play out directly. A patient of mine, 71 years old, fit, non-smoker, no significant cardiovascular history, came in with gradually worsening peripheral circulation. Cold hands, diminished capillary refill in his feet, mildly elevated pulse wave velocity on vascular testing. His vitamin K2 level was undetectable on serum testing. He'd been taking a high-quality magnesium supplement for 2 years with no meaningful improvement in his vascular assessments. 12 months after adding 200 micrograms of MK7 daily, his pulse wave velocity had improved measurably, and his peripheral circulation symptoms had largely resolved. He looked at me and said, "I didn't know a vitamin could do that." That's what correcting the actual deficiency looks like. The second vitamin is vitamin D3. And I want to be specific about this because vitamin D is the most discussed and simultaneously most misunderstood vitamin in men's health. Here's what's wrong with how most men think about vitamin D. They associate it primarily with bone health and immune function. The clinical evidence on vascular function tells a far more specific story. Vitamin D receptors are expressed throughout the endothelium, the cellular lining of your arteries. When D3 binds to these receptors, it upregulates endothelial nitric oxide synthase, the enzyme that produces nitric oxide, the molecule that signals your arterial walls to relax and dilate. In other words, D3 is a direct upstream regulator of nitric oxide production. Without adequate D3, your endothelium cannot produce nitric oxide at optimal levels, regardless of how much dietary nitrate you consume or how much magnesium you take. The mechanism sits upstream of all of it. A 2016 meta-analysis published in the American Journal of Hypertension, reviewing 30 randomized controlled trials involving over 4,400 participants, found that vitamin D3 supplementation produced a statistically significant reduction in systolic blood pressure, averaging 2.4 millimeters of mercury, in participants who were deficient at baseline. In men over 55, deficiency at baseline is the majority case. A 2020 NHANES analysis found that 68% of American men over 55 had insufficient vitamin D levels when assessed against the threshold associated with optimal endothelial function. That threshold, 40 to 60 nanograms per milliliter, is higher than the conventional sufficiency cutoff of 20 nanograms per milliliter that most standard blood panels flag. Here's what that means in plain language. Your doctor may have told you your vitamin D is fine. The clinical evidence on endothelial function uses a different, higher target. And if your level is between 20 and 40, the research suggests your nitric oxide production is suboptimal. And here's why the overnight window is specifically critical for D3's vascular role. A 2019 study from the University of Auckland followed 81 men over 60 through continuous 24-hour blood pressure monitoring. Men with lower vitamin D levels showed a blunted nocturnal dip, what clinicians call the nighttime blood pressure dip that normally occurs during deep sleep as the cardiovascular system recovers and restores. Non-dippers, men whose blood pressure doesn't fall adequately at night, show significantly higher rates of cardiovascular events than dippers, independent of their daytime blood pressure readings. D3 deficiency was independently associated with non-dipper status in this cohort. Correcting D3 helps restore the nocturnal cardiovascular recovery that healthy vascular function depends on. Now here's what makes these two vitamins clinically distinct from magnesium and why the combination matters. Magnesium supports nitric oxide synthase function. It's a cofactor in the enzymatic reaction. K2 removes the arterial calcification that physically stiffens the arterial wall and reduces its responsiveness to nitric oxide signals. D3 upregulates the production of nitric oxide synthase itself. These are 3 different points in the same pathway. Magnesium without K2 means you're supporting an enzyme in an arterial wall that's progressively stiffening from calcification. K2 without D3 means you're reducing calcification in an endothelium that can't produce adequate nitric oxide to dilate. The King's College trial I referenced at the opening used K2 and D3 in combination precisely because the researchers understood this mechanistic synergy. The 40% greater improvement in flow-mediated dilation over magnesium alone reflects what happens when you address the pathway at two upstream points simultaneously. Let me give you the evidence-based action plan. First, get your vitamin D level tested. Specifically request the 25-hydroxy vitamin D test and ask for your numerical result, not just a pass or fail. The target supported by the endothelial function literature is 40 to 60 nanograms per milliliter. If you are below 40, the standard therapeutic dose is 2,000 to 4,000 IU of D3 daily, taken with your largest meal of the day because D3 is fat-soluble and requires dietary fat for absorption. Do not take it in the evening. Emerging chronobiology research suggests D3 taken at night may interfere with melatonin synthesis. Morning or midday is optimal. This is supported by the research. Second, add vitamin K2 in the MK7 form, not MK4, which has a much shorter half-life and requires multiple daily doses to maintain serum levels. The dose used in the Maastricht trial was 180 micrograms. A practical daily target is 150 to 200 micrograms of MK7. Take it alongside D3 with your main meal. There is an important clinical note here. If you are on anticoagulant medication, specifically warfarin, speak with your prescribing physician before adding any form of vitamin K, as K2 can interact with warfarin's mechanism. For men not on anticoagulants, K2 at this dose has an excellent safety profile across the trial literature. This is supported by the research. Third, do not discontinue magnesium. The point of this video is not that magnesium is ineffective. It is that K2 and D3 address mechanisms that magnesium does not, and combining all three covers more of the pathway than any single agent. If you are already taking magnesium glycinate or magnesium citrate, continue. Add K2 and D3 as upstream complements, not replacements. The goal is a complete protocol, not a substitution. Fourth, give the protocol time. Arterial calcification does not reverse overnight, and MGP activation by K2 builds progressively. The Maastricht trial showed meaningful results at 3 years. Shorter-term studies show measurable changes at 12 to 16 weeks. Set your expectation at 90 days for initial reassessment. Track your sleep quality, morning energy, cold extremities, and blood pressure readings as practical proxies for vascular improvement. These are supported by the research. You haven't been getting this wrong because you weren't paying attention. You've been getting incomplete information. Advice that correctly identified one part of the pathway and missed the mechanisms upstream of it. The clinical evidence is now specific enough to address blood flow restoration at the level of arterial calcification, endothelial nitric oxide production, and overnight vascular recovery simultaneously. That is a different conversation than the one most men over 50 have been having. Now you can have it. Tell me one thing you believed about blood flow or supplementation that this video changed. I read every comment, and what you share tells me where the real gaps in this conversation are. I'm Dr. Emily Carter. Magnesium is valuable, but the clinical evidence clearly shows that vitamin K2 and vitamin D3 work through mechanisms magnesium cannot reach. And for men over 50, correcting those deficiencies is where the most meaningful overnight vascular recovery begins. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next one.